When you're picking a security vendor, you have to trust that they're going to help you sleep better at night, and they're going to continually be at the forefront, battling the adversaries, identifying their latest tools, their latest techniques, and what they're doing, and being able to build that into the product so that you can have those detection and prevention capabilities so you don't have to worry about it. And if you ask our customers, that's the number one thing they say to us is like, I just sleep better at night knowing you guys have our back and that you're monitoring all of our identities.
This is Identity at the Center. If it has anything to do with IAM, this is the go-to podcast. Now your hosts, Jim McDonald and Jeff Stedman.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff, how are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
I'm doing great. You know why I think identity is at the center?
Why is that?
Because I think it's at the center of information security. One of the things that I find so fascinating is when you get into kind of how exploits happen, and usually it's centered on some kind of, evil activity, if you will, when it comes to identity. And we're going to talk a lot about that today with our guests. I just want to say, I think it's going to be a really fascinating episode.
Yeah, this is going to be a fun one. And yeah, just to make it clear, this is a sponsored episode. We call these sponsor spotlights. And basically, we create these in collaboration with our partners out there and helps get their viewpoints on. And we can get a little more in depth into specific vendors and technologies and their viewpoints, which is something we actually try to stay away from on our normal episodes where it's more vendor neutral. So that is not today. Make it clear, this is a fully sponsored episode. And today's sponsor is Permiso. And you can find them at permiso.io/IDAC. We'll have a link in our show notes for people to check it out. Their website, as I'm looking at it right now, first of all, I love the design of it.
Yeah, it's really cool.
Yeah, it has a tagline of real-time identity security for all environments. That sounds like a mouthful. I want to find out more about what that means. So to help us with that, we've got the co-founder and co-CEO from Permiso, Paul Nguyen. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thanks for having me. I'm honored to be a guest on this.
Well, the honor is all yours, as you just said. We like to find more out about the people in this space. I know we're going to talk about Permiso and what you guys bring to the table, but I'm always curious, how did people get into this space of identity? How did you get into IAM? Do you think you're an IAM, or maybe it's something adjacent? I'm not sure. Is it something that you chose, or did it choose you?
I think I came into it late in my career because I started in security. So I started as a snot-nosed hacker who broke into things 20 some odd years ago. And I could tell you, definitely, I've been compromising credentials for a very, very long time, all the way back to like NTLM hashes and pass the hash on Windows machines from way back when. So I think I've always been around identity, but I never really focused on it until the last 5 years. And I have a different appreciation for folks that are dealing with it day in and day out, especially as IAM professionals. So I can't say I am an expert at it. I am learning it, and I'm learning a lot from all these folks as I talk to them and as I go to different shows and try to school up as much as I can.
I feel like identity is kind of having a moment in the sun here for the last, 5 years or so. I mean, it's always been important, but do you feel like, hey, identity is so hot right now, right? Like the meme. What is it that's coming out there? Is it just is becoming more well-known? Is it people just recognizing it? Because it's not like we just invented this idea of identity and identity security, right, within the last couple of years.
I think for us, I came from a different angle, which was I felt like identity was being targeted more and more by the adversaries. And so traditional security controls were mostly focused on email, network, endpoint. And I think identity was always a part of it, but it was kind of always a piece of all those different major focal points. And I think in the last 5 years, and the reason why I quit my nice, cushy executive job at FireEye running product there and working for Kevin Mandia was I really felt like this is the area that needed to be focused on because no one was really serving it well. And so I said, you know what, let's take a leap of faith and focus on the cross-section of identity and security, and let's see what we can find out.
And so then you went off and co-founded Permiso. First of all, am I saying that correctly? Permiso?
You are, yes. And Oddly enough, I think, it was definitely derived from us wanting to go into identity and said, oh, like permissions, that's cool. A funny aside, my friend who all speak Spanish, obviously, and I do have a vanity plate on my car, and my friend said, you do realize when you're speeding past people, it also could stand for excuse me. So I was like, oh, I guess I'm being kind of rude with this vanity plate. And it's not a sports car, it's a minivan. So I can't even say like it's a cool like vanity plate on a cool car.
Well, you've got. I think it's very polite. Like, excuse me, you just got passed by a minivan. That's one way to look at it for sure. I guess now that we've mentioned sort of the name, tell us about Permiso. What is it that you guys are bringing to the market, and then how do you guys set yourself apart from maybe others that are in that space? Give me some idea, because I mentioned this tagline of identity, for all environments, identity security for all environments. That's a lot, man.
It is. I actually asked this provocative question to some of the folks on the customer side, CISOs in particular, or CIOs, and I asked them, can you tell me who your top 10 riskiest identities are right now at this very minute? I think a lot of people try to answer that question by, oh, well, the inherent risk is Paul has a lot of permissions in the environment, therefore he must be the most risky. And that is a part of the equation. But I think what we realized was if you bring in the real-time aspect is behavior changes pretty quickly, especially let's say as an example, you get phished or there's a business email compromise. Well, that just changed from 5 minutes ago when you got phished and that credential is now compromised. And that identity is now acting erratically and logging in from random places and accessing resources never accessed. And I think this is what we were observing in the adversary side. And so we're talking about real-time security for identities in cloud and on-prem because it is a hard job. In our largest customer, we're monitoring close to 8 million human or non-human identities at any given moment. And to be able to do that real-time monitoring, you have to be able to have a full understanding of what they're doing at every second and be able to determine whether that behavior is malicious or not. So I think that's really where we've built our superpowers, is coming from our backgrounds from Mandiant, which if you're familiar with Mandiant, there's some of the best responders in the world. We worked a lot of breaches with identity as a core of the attack, and we'll go into more details around that. And that's really where I believe the inflection point for us was 3 years ago, with some of these attacks that really brought to light the fact that the identity infrastructure was under attack, and you needed real-time monitoring to be able to detect that as fast as you can.
So how does this work? Is it pulling in data from all of your different applications and your cloud environments and saying, okay, let's throw this all together and then figure out who is Paul and what is risky? Like how does this work?
That's a great question. So you're absolutely right. The first thing we need to understand is, well, what are all the identities operating in the environment? So you need an accurate inventory. So whether it is at the, let's say, cloud service provider level with AWS, Azure, GCP, or it's at the SaaS level, which we believe SaaS is probably one of the most untouched areas right now, in a bit of the wild, wild west. And then you need to integrate with any on-prem as well. So Active Directory, your traditional authentication sources. And so unless you have that visibility of where those identities are living, what permissions they have. And the third part, which you mentioned as well, is we have to be able to pull all the activity logs across all those different sources. And one of the things we do is we're essentially like a flight recorder for every identity. So I could say, you know what, Jeff, I saw you log in at 10:03 a.m. yesterday. Here's how you logged in with this device, with this MFA factor. Oh, and I saw you download these documents in 365, and then you logged into Jira and you created some tickets. And then you went into Slack and you sent some messages and you downloaded some docs. I could record all of that. And then I could look at that activity and determine, was Jeff acting normally, or was he potentially a compromised credential from an external threat actor?
Well,
or
Jeff is never acting normally. That's probably the first thing right there.
Well, funny enough, the one that's been really hot, especially after the Rippling deal, if you saw that lawsuit that's happening, it's an insider threat case. And so I think insider threat now is becoming a bigger one, especially with layoffs. So that's been a big topic in the last couple of months for us.
I mean, that's got to be just an enormous amount of data to pull from all these sources, right? And each source is its own complication, right? To the amount of data pulling in, then you try to add real time on top of that. What does it take to run this sort of thing? Is this something that I can set up and run, pretty easily? Does it take a couple weeks? I imagine you've got to establish baselines as far as, what is normal, or at least normal for that individual, and then start to apply some of those heuristics to the access profile to say, okay, yeah, this is normal for Jeff, or maybe no, this is not normal because he's traveling, or maybe he is accessing different things that he normally wouldn't be.
Well, I'll tell you from past experience of having to do this for 20 years and running the FireEye product business, I wanted the anti-on-prem software profile. So we had two principles when we built the platform. One was it's completely SaaS delivered. So it's fast time to onboard was a big principle for us. Super easy, has to get on board within 10 to 15 minutes. Depending upon the integration, that can happen pretty easily. And it's all read-only, so we're not trying to be intrusive in terms of that. The other principle was fast time to value, because I always struggled where customers had to plug it in, they had to wait some time, and then they said, oh, okay, it's interesting, a couple things lit up, fantastic. To answer your question, because we have come in from an incident response standpoint in the past, we've had to go and ingest historical logs. So if you have logs for the last 2 to 3 years, I could ingest those and think of it as like a replay button. I could replay every identity session over the last 2 years if you had 2 years worth of data, and I can reconstruct all of that pretty quickly and allow you now to get visibility around, well, yeah, just 6 months ago, although I just plugged in Permiso right now, I could see 6 months ago, Jim went and he ran these sets of malicious operations, and we know exactly which credential was compromised first and all the subsequent credentials that were created because of that. So I think that's something that I learned in the past of doing this, is like, I can't have something that's going to take forever to deploy and forever to get value. And so you get up and running anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes, depending on how complex it is, all the way to, a couple hours and within a day.
I love that ability to show something sooner rather than later, because the world doesn't work on a, give me money and I'll show you something in 2 years. Like, no, we need to see value sooner than that. What is something that you think has really set you apart from, others that might be playing in the same space? Like, what is the thing that you point in and say, yeah, this is why we're different than so-and-so?
So you brought up one of them, right? And this is something I purposely tried to focus on with Jason early on, was we need to be completely different from a branding standpoint, that we stood out. So yes, that is a Yeti with a towel around its rear end, because one of our monikers and campaigns that we ran was Permiso covers your star AAS in the cloud. So, IaaS, SaaS is a little bit of a play. So we are a little bit tongue in cheek, and we're pretty bold. If you go to our website, there's actually Easter eggs on there too. So pretty funny, I'd say probably like 12-year-old maturity level Easter eggs on there, definitely because of me. But I think, just joking aside, our branding definitely has been useful. But the number one thing that we've tried to do, because I can actually feel this from a customer standpoint. I used to be a CISO back in the day as well. There's way too many vendors. Like, how do you know who you can trust? And so one of the things I did was, let's go back to first principles of, if you share your intel, your research, your insights with the community, you build goodwill, because at that point, you're trying to raise the whole community up, right? It's not about me trying to keep proprietary information. So if you look at our blog in particular, and if you go to permiso.io/blog, you'll see that we've open sourced about 12 tools in the last 12 months. We've shared a lot of our intel, our insights. And if there's the one thing that really sets us apart is really that research that allows us to, one, show that we are experts in terms of identifying these identity-based attacks, but also it allows us to show that we're powering our product with this type of expertise. And we're doing this every day. And I tell a customer all the time, when you're picking a security vendor, you have to trust that they're going to help you sleep better at night, and they're going to continually be at the forefront, battling the adversaries, identifying their latest tools, their latest techniques, and what they're doing, and being able to build that into the product so that you can have those detection and prevention capabilities, so you don't have to worry about it. And if you ask our customers, that's the number one thing they say to us is like, I just sleep better at night knowing you guys have our back and that you're monitoring all of our identities.
I love the website. I gotta ask, that the art style is very unique, and I like, who does the art for this stuff? Because it's awesome.
We had a little bit, I'd say, of a family advantage, which Jason's brother is actually a world-class creative person. He's done Super Bowl ads, done stuff for Cameo, Apple, and we said, hey, here's a couple shares. Can you help us come up with something crazy? And he came up with something absolutely crazy, and he gave us a whole bunch of different ones. But this is definitely a unique styling that is more playful. It's different than the doom and gloom, the guys in hoodies. It's like such cliche. It's such a cliche over the last 27 years. I'm just kind of tired of this overused kind of style. And I think the security market needs to have a little more fun. And we don't take ourselves seriously. And if you look at our campaigns, we kind of make fun of things, right? And that's just my playful way of like, hey, let's not take things too seriously. Let's have some fun while we're doing this.
I totally agree on the hoodies and the Scream 2 mask, like or I don't even know what you call that one where the guy looks like
the
like
Guy
he's
Fawkes
playing-
mask, right? From whatever it is, yeah.
Yeah, it's
With
so
data
overplayed.
flying in the background, right? It's like, ooh, okay.
Ones and zeros behind his head. So, Paul, I'm wondering, I'm thinking about some of the big hacks that have come out that I'm sure all of our listeners have at least aware of in name, scatter spider, LLM jacking. Like these are the things that are coming out and they're leveraging the identity and maybe that's the answer, right? They're leveraging the identity to my question, but I'm wondering why you would need a new tool to catch these things and to stop these things. Why can't the traditional security tools get in the way of that?
Well, I'll tell you one thing, having been on the other side where I was breaking into things, we're lazy. We want to take the path of least resistance. So if you think about, I'll call it pre-federation of identities. If I was trying to break into 20 systems, I'd have to go break into one system and then try to move across and find the right credential that would allow me to walk through each of those doors. Now, the great side of identity federation was, you know what? We're going to eliminate that surface area for the number of credentials that are being used. But the dark side of that is if adversaries get a hold of those single sign-on credentials, guess what? That just makes their job a lot easier. So the moniker today, especially as you deconstruct the modern architecture, and by the way, this is a little odd, but I actually started my career as a programmer on a mainframe. So if I look at the mainframe, everything was centralized on the mainframe. We were using RACF, ACF2, top secret for our access controls back then. I was running my JCL jobs. I was programming in PL1. A little bit different. So if you look at it, it's almost like food, right? You talk about these Michelin star restaurants that deconstruct food into. I think we've deconstructed the tech stack right now. So it used to be data centers, and we were standing up servers and building our own data centers. Now you're breaking out the data center into cloud service providers providing the infrastructure. Then you have services that are being delivered by different SaaS vendors. So what's stitching that all together now that we've deconstructed it? APIs and credentials. That's really what's stitching it together in a bunch of code. So I think that movement to cloud and that deconstruction has created a greater emphasis on identity. And I think also with federation, and we talk about bad guys don't hack in anymore. It's not like they're using malware to hack in. In this modern stack, they log in. So they're buying credentials. They're finding any which way to get those. They'll pay you for your credentials, and they'll get access, and they'll bypass MFA. And once they're in, they're in. It's a little bit of a different approach than it was 10, 15 years ago with malware and viruses. If you remember old school, if you had Symantec and Norton antivirus, like you're good, right? That was security. Yeah. So I think it's evolved quite a bit since then. I do believe identity is at the center of it all.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, talk about some of those modern attacks. Scatter Spider, like I said, most people I think have heard of it, but can you tell us a little bit more about what it was and what the impact was for companies that unfortunately got hammered by this thing?
Sure. And by the way, this is something that we do all the time, which is we provide no strings attached, no salespeople threat briefings. So I'll give you a bit of a mini version of that threat briefing because we've been doing it quite a bit for the last 2 years. Probably the poster children for that one was Caesar's MGM. In terms of Scattered Spider in particular. Now, I could say that was a great event for us because I think it really created a lot of education around the identity infrastructure. But if you look back at what they were trying to focus on, one, they were buying credentials off a Russian marketplace, and they were focused on specific people that they believed had a lot of privileges into the environment. And so they're going after Okta, they're going after Entra, they're going after Ping. So that was the IDP was a great source because you assume if you get an IDP credential, you're going to have access to a whole lot of things. I have to do less in terms of lateral movement within the environment. Perfect. So that's where it started. Let's focus on compromising an IDP credential. That group was also behind the T-Mobile breach as well. And why does that matter? That matters because SIM swapping makes it easy to bypass MFA. And so it was a multi-pronged approach in which they happened to be, compromising T-Mobile previously. one that gave them an opportunity now to bypass MFA. They've also resorted to some more heavy-handed tactics, I'd say, swatting, physical threats. They find out what your wife's name is, your kids' names, and they say, hey, if you don't accept this, we're gonna do some harm to your children, to your wife, and they'll follow it up with swatting. So there's different ways to persuade people to give up their credentials. So if you assume once you're past that door, right, the authentication side of it, what happens then? Well, you're riding that identity highway into all the SaaS applications that are federated into it, like 365, Jira, Confluence, and then you're also going into the infrastructure, right? So AWS, Azure, even on-prem as well, if there's a VPN. So what was the major mission for them? The major mission for them was actually to steal intellectual property, and they would extort you. So in some cases, some of the largest extortions we saw were about $50 million. He said, if you don't pay us $50 million, we'll release your source code, and there goes your competitive advantage, and now your competitors have your source code. Big impact, right? Caesar's MGM was a little bit different, where there was some disruption, obviously, to the services that the hospitality industry was providing. So they had different outcomes, but at the end of the day, it was still extortion, right? Pay me tens of millions of dollars. So why is that important? I think it's important because that's one of the most high-profile cases where they really focused on the identity infrastructure to get access. And the second was, if you've been following this Rippling deal lawsuit that's been happening because it was an insider threat, and it was focused on essentially setting up honeypots where they would go find out, okay, well, clearly Deal has an insider somewhere at Rippling that's providing them information, and they're trying to figure out who this insider was. And the way that they detected it actually was because they were monitoring the search terms, and they set a honeypot up with specific terms in a document. And so once they knew someone was searching for those terms, they knew who the culprit was. And so if you look at Scattered Spider, one of the most interesting and novel things that we saw in that, and that we actually pioneered this technique, was, and everyone uses Google or Perplexity or name your latest search right now, right? Well, search actually gives you a sense of intent, because I'm searching for, let's say, a car. Well, I'm probably looking to buy a car. The unique part of this adversary group was they were using search for about 70 hours to recon the environment. They're looking for AKIA. They're looking for other credentials. They're looking for secrets. They're looking for other access keys. They're looking for infrastructure deployment guides. And that was an interesting new area that we saw in the SaaS world that was like, wow, this is a new technique that we're identifying right now. It's right here on the front lines. And that does deal with exactly what we're seeing now in the Rippling deal effect as well on the insider threat side. But yeah, I think that's it, right? Use identity. Let's go log into all the different applications that it has access to. Let's steal information. Let's get away with it. And these were not sophisticated adversaries, by the way. These were keyboard jockeys that didn't know how to script, and they were logging into websites. So this was not like some nation state. These are a bunch of actually teenagers that were doing this.
Yeah, right. And okay, you said they searched for AKIA.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
It's actually a prefix for an AWS access key. So,
right.
Yeah. And they're searching for code signing certs, so .pfx. So because code signing certs are obviously an issue, right, for tech companies if they lose their code signing cert. It's fascinating when you look at their search terms, and we published it actually on our blog. It's clear that they had no idea what the heck they were doing because they were searching for everything.
Yeah, well, that kind of puts a bullseye on their back potentially. But look how much damage they did. There's another big incident that hit the news, the LLM jacking incident. Tell us about that one and kind of what was behind it. And again, impact too.
So this one's going to be a little bit, I'll call it a little more seedy, just in terms of like what they did. I mean, compromised access keys are not new by any means. We actually were observing some abnormal behavior related to some AWS infrastructure in our clients. And it was specific to Bedrock. And if you're familiar with Bedrock, Bedrock is the AI infrastructure service for hosting things like Anthropic models, et cetera. And we're like, what are they doing with Bedrock? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And once we started to pull the thread on it, what we realized was they're actually using access keys, like stolen access keys, to then abuse Bedrock to steal free Bedrock services. And then they were jailbreaking Anthropic models and other AI models. What were they doing? They're creating role-playing sex bots that they could go sell subscriptions to. And so, of course, this was an interesting one because this involves essentially non-human identity and an AWS access key. Now you're looking at AI services and AI infrastructure. So you have a cross section of NHI and AI. And we were actually one of the first ones to disclose this. And Brian Krebs, if you're familiar with Brian Krebs, he breaks a lot of the latest breaches, right? So he had the exclusive on our story, and he did the investigation. He's like, wow, this was fascinating. And subsequently, we've been referenced several times by a lot of other big vendors like Wiz and other folks in their blogs. And I think that's a cool thing about what we're trying to do is we're trying to be always at the forefront of finding these unique things, like the LLM jacking or some of the search term indicators and ways of detection. And I think that's going back to your question on differentiation is if I continually show like we're at the forefront of this and we're finding things that no one else is finding, I think that just helps to demonstrate that you're going to sleep better at night just knowing that we're going to be doing this for you instead of you having to do this 24/7. And I think the LLM jacking one is interesting now that the advent of Gen AI and the adoption of AI is going to increase significantly in the enterprise, and then agentic AI. I have to admit, I'm a little worried about Skynet, and that's not something I ever thought I'd worry about. But boy, I've watched all those Terminator movies, and I am scared.
So you talked about honeypots a little bit. Is that something that you recommend people use?
So I think it depends for what purpose. I mean, we've set up our own honeypots as well, just because we as an example, try to, in the vein of being at the forefront of identifying what the adversaries are doing, we'll leak access keys. We'll leak a couple things just to see what the behavior is. And actually in that LLM jacking, because some of our customers didn't have the proper logging on, we couldn't actually see what the prompts that they were submitting to the AI models. So we ended up setting a honeypot up. And of course, we were able to pull them in, and we were able to observe, well, what were the prompts that were being submitted to the models. And so we use honeypots all the time just for our own research purposes. I think if it makes sense for a customer, it's hard to maintain, right? Because you have to continually create new content and make sure that you're observing and monitoring it. Otherwise, it's just another set of pictures. Exactly. Yeah. And that's the tough part is just maintaining and keeping up and watching what they're doing at all times. For us, it's a little bit easier when you're doing it for research purposes and not in a concern of losing anything per se or understanding that they're going to attack us. So that's, if you have the resources, go for it. If not, I think a lot of other vendors do it as well on your behalf.
Yeah, I think it's a good topic. I think you just mentioned the point there, right? If you have a honeypot out there and you're not monitoring whether or not it's getting hit, then it's not doing you any good. Kind of in the same vein, we've seen some ridiculous numbers in terms of how long after a breach it takes for an organization to realize they've been breached. You had a statistic on your website, and I don't remember what it was, but how long was that?
So I think if you go with the real big vendors who have, the typical Verizon reports or CrowdStrike reports, they'll probably say anywhere between 10 to 15 days for dwell time, which is the amount of time that an adversary sits in an environment and goes undetected. So I think what we're seeing right now in the most recent Scattered Spider incident was about 74 hours from beginning to execution of the attack itself, and the 70 out of the 74 hours was the recon time. So they executed that mission in about 3 days. So not very sophisticated, right? You're able to go and to pull this off because one, I don't think people had proper visibility to be able to detect it in the first place. So if you're, and this is a part of the formula, right? So over time, let's think about just passwords in general. Like, what was the complexity of the passwords we started with? It was like a couple characters, right? And then you started getting to 16 characters because we used to do rainbow tables and password cracking back in the day with different tools. And then you added complexity and you added characters. So I think this is the same game that's being played with these folks. Is right now, I think the level of maturity in terms of being able to monitor identities across all these different layers is not quite unified right now. And that allows you now to kind of hide in those gaps. And you'll see shards of like, okay, we saw something happening in GitHub, but okay, is that correlated to something else that happened in Jira? I think it's hard to stitch that picture together. And I think that's where we've noticed in the breaches that we've worked, where they hide, right? It was in between those gaps.
I'm wondering, I mean, you work with a lot of clients, you get to see what team gets brought to the table, roles and responsibilities within the organization. I'm wondering, most of our listeners are identity practitioners. Are they the folks who are, does the buck stop with them for dealing with these or getting ahead of these issues, or is it somewhere else within the organization?
I would tell you probably the most advanced, I'll call it organizational behavioral structure that I've seen is a customer of ours created an identity security team, which is essentially an overlay cross-functional team that was working across the IAM teams as well as the security teams to create more unified visibility for identity. Because I don't think this is an either or type of responsibility, because if you think about IAM professionals, I didn't have a full deep appreciation for how complex and how hard it is to stand up and manage and maintain that infrastructure and try to get everyone bought into the standards. Like that's a hard job. So I look at that as prevention, right? So you're putting in place the proper controls and the proper prevention to ensure you have the right authentication, right authorization. But guess what? Controls fail, as we see in breaches. So you do need the security team to monitor that when all else fails, are we able to your question, Jim, are we able to detect when that happens? Because you can't expect you're 100% secure at all times. That's just not reasonable. So you need both sides to continually work with each other, because there might be things that are happening on the threat environment that helps inform the IAM team that, hey, you know what? We need to put these types of controls in place because we're starting to see emerging attacks around this area. So let's say, as an example, NHI is a big one. Non-human identity is kind of a big one right now, right? So we're seeing a rise in attacks around NHIs. So what do we need to do better around NHIs? NHIs have been around for a long time. Service accounts, service principals have been around for a long time, but you don't have to worry about the problem until it becomes a real pressing issue. So I think it's a joint effort, honestly. And if you look at our engagements with our customers, yes, we might have come in from an incident that happened and we helped them respond to that incident. Then we helped build detection capabilities to ensure that if the adversary comes back, we're able to detect it. But our biggest engagement actually has been IAM teams. So we just launched a whole prevention part of our platform. And was it because we wanted to go into prevention? It was because the customer said, I can't have this happen again. So if you look at the symptoms of what happened, one is there's a lot of orphaned and stale accounts and unknown risks around access keys that were exposed for human and non-human identities. And then there's a lot of over-permissioning. So in the example of an Okta credential that gets compromised, one thing we observed is this credential never accessed GitHub for 3 years. So you could argue at that point, if you had removed the access, would have it completely stopped the attack? Probably not. It probably would just create enough friction where they'd go, this is kind of annoying that I don't have access to GitHub. I'll find another way around to get access to GitHub. So I think it's a joint effort. I do believe the construct that I talked about, which is like a unified identity security team, is a little bit of a lesser minority implementation. But I do feel like there's a large convergence happening with those teams. It's just my gut.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. So as you're talking about all these things, and again, the website is permiso.io. We also say /IDAC. If you go there, Paul's going to put something there for you to get for free. And hopefully, I'm hoping there's an Easter egg there. I also wanted to go through the spelling is PERMISO, like miso soup, PERMISO.io. But I think at this point in the conversation, Paul, people are probably asking, like, okay, you sold us. There's all this that we need to be worried about. How does Permiso help? How does Permiso help me solve this problem?
I will tell you this. The only way to kind of prove out, are we really worth the time and effort? Because I get it. I think, you know what? It's annoying talking to vendors. Vendors call you. They're nagging you with emails, LinkedIn messages. I mean, you name it. I think the first thing I would ask anyone that would want to talk to us is just look at our research, right? Just determine whether you think we know what we're talking about, or we just put a bunch of words on our website and try to say, oh, we do all these things. Because guess what? There's a lot of people that go out there and can easily put words out and say they do a whole lot of things. I think the proof is in the pudding in terms of what we've been able to do in the past. I think the best way that we try to prove value is if I'm not giving you unique insights into your environment at all that you didn't know about, and I call that unknown risk, right? So if you already know what risk you're managing, there's a certain percentage, call it 10 to 15% of unknown risk that you don't know about because you don't have the right visibility or you don't have the right monitoring in place to determine whether those things are happening. So what is it that we're looking for? On the detection side, the response side, it's really two simple questions we're trying to answer. One is, do we believe that there's any compromised credentials in the environment, human or non-human, from an external threat actor? The other, which is a harder problem to solve, is the insider threat issue. So they have legitimate access into the environment. So the pattern of detection is a little bit different because they are going to come from a valid device. They're going to come from a valid MFA factor. So they're going to look normal. So how do you start to determine when people are starting to act abnormally? I'll give you two examples. So the externally compromised credential, that was the scattered spider use case, right? It was an outside threat actor that was compromising a valid credential, and then they gained access into the environment. One of the more recent examples for us is, let's say you had to lay off 1,000 people tomorrow. What are the things that you need to worry about? One is, did I remove all access? Number one. The second is, can I detect if they're exhibiting any kind of destructive behavior that could be impactful to the company? And I will tell you, when you're trying to lay off people at that scale, things will fall to the crack. And then this is what we observed is people mass downloading documents from SharePoint, right? Downloading documents with Salesforce, hurrying up to get until they got their access cut off. That's a big problem, right, on the insider threat side. And then, of course, this Rippling Deal lawsuit is another indication of that insider threat. So that's on the detection side. That's what we care about. So if you move left of that problem, what precipitated those issues? I think that's the hygiene side or the posture side, right? How do I start to prevent this from happening? Which is, let's clean up all the attack surface around the identity. Any orphaned accounts, stale accounts, zombie accounts that may exist in your infrastructure, in SaaS, on-prem, with your Active Directory, you name it. That's number one. Second is you've got to deal with authorization risks around least privilege and over-permissioning. So I gave you that example in Scattered Spider where the credentials that were compromised had access to resources that they hadn't touched in a long time. So if you look at this, the real root cause of all of this, it's a multi-pronged issue, which is both you could do prevention, but you do need monitoring together at the same time. I think what we're noticing is a lot of vendors are focusing on one or the other without bringing the two together. I think that's what makes us unique is that visibility for both prevention and detection for human and non-human identities for your cloud and for your on-prem. So we're actually trying to save our customers some money. Instead of having to buy 5 different solutions, we'll cover all your identity security needs from one place as best as we can. Are we perfect? No, I'm not going to sell you snake oil and say, we're the best at everything. But I think the one area I can claim we are the absolute best at is the detection and the response side, given our background of dealing with frontline attacks against some of these adversaries.
And so, Paul, I mean, when you talk about Permiso, do you call it a platform? Is it a couple different solutions or products? How do we think about it?
Let me approach it in a little bit of a different way. I'm going to use non-marketing words because I think actually the word identity security is a little bit of a bastardized term right now because what is security in the first place? And I was a CISO, right? And I had a fixed amount of budget and I can only spend so much. And what's my job? My job is to buy down risk, deploying that money into people, process, or technologies. So security fundamentally is a risk management function. So what is it that I care about? I care about helping our customers manage the risks to their identities, which means I need to enumerate all the things that I talked about, right? So all the vulnerabilities of the potential gaps that could be exploited by a threat actor that could turn into an incident. So I think that's it's more about identity risk management. Do I want to be an IGA solution? No, I don't think that makes sense for us because I think we need to end up being almost like an Equifax or TransUnion or an Experian around understanding. I need to understand all the attributes of risk related to an identity and be that clearinghouse for understanding. You know what? Paul is the riskiest identity in the environment. One, because he's over permissioned, but two, he's logging in from Vietnam and he just switched from an Android device for his MFA factor to an iOS, which never happens, by the way, very rarely. Or he downgraded from iOS 18.2 to iOS 16.1, rarely happens. These are all signals and symptoms, and all of a sudden he's starting to create users and exhibit this weird behavior. I think those are all signals you need to capture and be able to understand. Well, Paul is now the riskiest identity because both inherently he has a lot of permissions, but his behavior is quite erratic, and now he's exhibiting symptoms of potentially a compromised credential.
Jeff, I think we need to cut Paul off from our podcasting platform. Once this podcast is recorded, kill his credentials for life.
Why would we do that? Paul's our friend.
He's our friend, but he's so risky.
We're in the opposite market, right? For podcast growth is we want everybody to get out there.
Absolutely.
It's true. It's true. So Paul, one of the things that you talk about with Permiso is the universal identity graph. And I wanted to, because this is like front and center on your website. Why is that? Why is that front and center? Why is that the first thing you think about or read about when you go to permiso.io/IDAC?
Well, I think I talked about it a little bit before, which was some of the core principles that I learned in security is one, you need to know what you're protecting. So if you don't have an accurate inventory of the identity attack surface, then it's hard for you to know, you know what, I need to protect this credential because Paul owns this credential. But one of the harder problems that we're trying to solve is, let's say if you're going to get rid of me tomorrow, right? How would you know which credentials that I've used or owned in the environment? It's easy if you were saying everything was federated, and if I just cut off my federated identity, all's good, right? The challenge is there's a lot of non-federated identities that are operating in the environment because I may have local access to something that wasn't federated through let's say Okta. The third problem is I may also own non-human identities. So I may have secrets or OAuth tokens that I've authorized, or long-lived access keys that belong to me. So you need an accurate inventory of what is the composite identity surface area for Paul, including all the credentials he uses and all the permissions that he has. So that graph is really about just maintaining that a proper state of who is Paul as a human entity, and then all the credentials and permissions that he owns. And we also do this for non-human identities as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. So I totally agree. You had me sold right when you said you have to have an inventory of your attack surface, which almost seems like impossible. So is it that Permiso helps you develop that? Because I doubt there's many clients that you go into and they're like, here's our spreadsheet, here's our attack surface.
No, I think it's a part of not just if they do have that information. So as an example, we've had a lot of requests to integrate with Workday. So Workday is a bit of their authoritative source for full-time employees and contractors, and we use that as a starting point through that integration. So it's both integrations into the IDP first and into HR systems like that to give us a sense of what's the baseline inventory. Because the majority of the credentials, at least for mature customers that have federated access, that's the easy low-hanging fruit. The second ring around that would be you need direct access and integration into all the sources that where there are credentials, let's say local credentials. So I'll have to integrate with every SaaS application, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Jira, GitHub. I'll have to integrate with Amazon. So there's a bit of an integration coverage you have to do as well, because if you can't enumerate the local credentials and even have access to the activity logs in where they're accessing those things, it's hard for you to get that visibility. So unfortunately, I think it is very similar to things in the past where, one, we will use the, let's say 80% rule. Let's get as much as we can from the right sources like the IDP or from HRIS systems, and then let's fill in the rest by enumerating the local credentials from there.
So that enumeration, I think, is where I was thinking is when I hear integration, I think of gaps, because nobody knows where that they might have identities. Is this one of the challenges that we need to try to solve for? Is okay, we know what applications we have, but the business is going to go in business. They're going to go out and sign up for a SaaS app or some other thing, right? And they're not being centrally managed. Is there a way or an opportunity to use Permiso to maybe discover some of that usage and say, hey, we've got some shadow IT problems over here. And oh, by the way, someone spun up their own entire AWS environment or whatever it might be, right? That is not being, that first of all, it's not even being aware of at like a governance standpoint, from security standpoint. But are there opportunities to leverage this information to do some of that discovery, to find the things that we don't know about our environment?
That's a great point, because you can only protect what you know, right? Sometimes there's a lot of unknowns. And I always talk about the unknown risk because you don't have 100% visibility into your environment. And I think this is where we have that real-time or runtime monitoring, because there are things you observe when you're seeing a set of activity. Let's say, for example, someone signs up for some SaaS application as an example. You may not see the initial registration workflow, but you'll see shards of activity where all of a sudden we see people accessing certain websites that are abnormal for what they normally go to, right? So that then starts to signal to us, okay, maybe someone's signing up for this particular SaaS application. We put that into what we consider an unknown state for in our inventory that needs to be reconciled, because now we don't know if that's authorized or unauthorized, and we don't know if that's a potential user that we know about or not. So that's potentially some ways. Are we perfect at like identifying shadow SaaS? No, I think there's a lot of other solutions that are more focused on the SaaS security side, or CASB or SASE, that can detect it from a network standpoint. That won't be our strongest suit per se, but there are methods that we use that, again, like think of it as like, I hate to call it Big Brother, but I am kind of like Big Brother in the environment, right? Monitoring every user, every identity, just watching what they're doing. And there are signals that we pick up sometimes that are saying, hey, this is unknown activity that we need to go investigate. That could be indicative of shadow SaaS or shadow IT as an example.
Yeah. That's a very important concept. One other thing that came to mind was, I remember a Gartner, I'm not sure if it's a Venn diagram, if it's only two circles, we can call it intersecting circles. It was SPM, Security Posture Management, and ITDR. And most products fell into one or the other. I would say the SPM was kind of more the network vendors, the Palo Altos, things like that. ITDR was kind of pure play ITDR. I don't remember if you guys were on that specific diagram, but it feels like, based on the research I've done, looking at the website, you kind of in that section where those two overlap. So you're SPM, but I'd say it's like identity SPM, which I think that I'd love to hear you clarify on that a little bit, and then talk about ITDR and what you bring to the table in terms of ITDR. It's a hot space, but what I've seen, like as I've investigated different ITDRs, is it's almost like a major bucket containing a bunch of different types of solutions. They don't all do the same thing. So I'd like to understand what you guys bring to the table in terms of the ITDR, and then what is this identity SPM piece, and why do you call it that, and what does Permiso bring to the table there?
That's a great question in terms of the acronym soup of ISPM and ITDR. I could probably throw in a couple more. IGA, we don't do IGA, but might as well throw in all the acronyms. But in terms of identity threat detection, what is it that the outcomes that you really care about? One is real-time monitoring of your identities to determine when they're compromised, either by an external threat actor like we talked about with Scattered Spider, or some of the insider threat use cases where you start to see, in mass layoffs, or potentially in the corporate espionage or the rippling deal effect. I think that's really what we care about, is like we want to do the real-time monitoring of your identities so you can sleep better knowing that no one's abusing those credentials. And if you go to the left of that, that's really the quote unquote ISPM, or the posture. I call that more prevention and hygiene management, which is you're trying to reduce the probability of an identity being compromised. So what do you need to do there? One is, of course, we're monitoring for behaviors like people using weak MFA methods, or I call them weak authentication controls, that allows it to be easier to compromise a credential. So we monitor for all those. We identify any cases where MFA is not being enforced, as an example. We try to identify any residual unknown accounts that may exist that people forgot about because either people left or whatever it may be. So zombie accounts, stale accounts. That's surface area. That's pretty low hanging fruit that you can go after, and you can feel comfortable that you can remove those, because a part of what we do is we also understand when that credential was last used and how it was used. So I could replay that credential and tell you it was last used a year ago, and Paul used it. And when he used it, he went into 365 and he downloaded a bunch of documents. So we give you a lot more context than I think a lot of other folks that just say, oh, it's an unused account. We could tell you it's an unused account, but it was used last year on this date at this time, and here's what it did. The other piece too is the least privilege side, which frankly, like least privilege, we've been chasing forever. It seems like it's a never ending problem with people moving jobs and roles. And I think what we see with developers, especially in this new infrastructure as code world, they give permissions until it works. So it's not about, I think, paring down permissions for security purposes. Like, how do I make this stupid piece of code work? And I will say I am guilty of it myself, because I am a hack developer compared to what I used to be. And I'll write code and like, what the heck? Like, I don't know why isn't this working? It says access denied or permissions not allowed. I'm like, okay, I'm just going to keep loading up permissions until it works. So I think that's really the prevention side or the ISPM. And I think that's where we're unique is you'll have other vendors that are doing just posture, but not detection. And some vendors that are just doing detection, but not posture. And some that are doing posture in cloud only, but not on-prem. So I think the hardest part for a customer is I think I put it together. If you think about the stack that I just talked about, ISPM, ITDR, I'll use the acronyms for descriptive purposes, for human and non-human identities in cloud and on-prem, that's probably 6 different solutions that you have to buy. And then you have to stitch those together to get the visibility that you need. And I think that's where we try to make it simpler for customers to get that unified visibility for all your identities in one place, human, non-human, cloud and on-prem, so you can help manage that risk as effectively as possible.
Yeah, I think this highlights, I think, the importance of visibility and observability and being able to understand who is in your environment, what are they doing with it, and then you can start to make intelligent decisions around, okay, well, what do you want to do about the information that's been presented to you? So I love this idea of again, combining that visibility and observability, and then give me data so that I can figure out, okay, is Paul being weird again? Or is this just normal Paul behavior? And, his 6 kids running around his house and like, oh, that is normal for that house. So I love that idea of combining both of those things. And I definitely want to encourage people, go out to the website, check it out. Permiso.io/IDAC. We'll have a link in our show notes for people to check that out. But definitely a powerful message there. I know you've been very, generous with your time here today. I did mention that you have 6 kids. That is a lot of kids, man. Tell me a little bit about your environment there and how much ISPM and ITDR and identity graphing are you doing even just in your own home to try and manage all this?
I constantly have to inventory that I have all my kids because I have lost a couple at Disney World. And the good thing is Disney World's really good at tracking down kids, but I was an only child, and I guess I married an Irish Catholic from Pittsburgh, and I ended up with 6 kids. So clearly I did not read that contract very well when I said I do. But they're 16 to 9, and we jammed them in pretty tight. And good Lord, sometimes I feel like I'm an Uber driver more than I am anything else. So I'm not sure what I'm. Well, yeah, you talk about like ITDR. Yes, I'm trying to detect nefarious activity from my kids all the time, especially as they have devices, and I don't know what the heck they're doing on their devices. That's the scary part of the internet now that I have kids is like, what the heck are they doing?
So knowing what you know and sort of your background in cybersecurity, do you think that makes you a better dad, or are you just an absolute nightmare of a dad because it is harder to get things past you, maybe?
I don't think I have enough time to be able to effectively monitor them. So I use the old school FUD approach, which is I scare them and say, you know what your father does? Your father monitors people all the time, and I know exactly what they're doing. So if you think you're going to pull one on me, you can try. I have had kids who've tried. So, and they probably didn't do it successfully. And unfortunately, that means that they think they can keep doing it. But I told them eventually I'll catch you. Don't worry about it.
Jim, you've got a couple kids. How do you approach your identity threat detection and response and identity security posture management for your kids?
You keep your attack surface as small as possible. So Paul didn't get that memo. You don't want to be outnumbered. So you keep it small. You still have to have fault tolerance for passing on your genetics. So I got 2. Didn't let them outnumber me. So I feel like I set the strategy. I stuck to the strategy. Now we've been in operations for a while. But guess what? Having kids, operations isn't always the funnest sport.
Did you just use fault tolerance with the idea of your children? I think that's
passing on your
hilarious.
genetics. Yeah, I know. It's actually, when you think about it, it was not a good analogy, but we do this thing live, Jeff, so it's out there now.
Yeah. Oh, this is why we end on a lighter note. Or else are you going to hear fault tolerance and genetics?
That's a good one.
Identity threat detection response all in one cohesive, nice, tidy little package of an episode.
I love it. I love it.
Paul, you've been great. Definitely interested in learning more about what you guys have going on. Looking forward to seeing you guys maybe at some conferences that we'll be probably at together over the next year or so. Definitely get people out there to the website, permiso.io/IDAC. That's PERMISO.io/IDAC. Speaking of letters and acronyms and things like that.
Miso soup.
So I guess final thoughts, Paul. What is something that if somebody's listening to this, what is your elevator pitch or your final thought that you want people to take away from this conversation before we close things up?
Disclaimer, I'm sorry if you lost 30 to 40 minutes of your life and you can't get it back. But like I said, we just want to be good contributing members of the community. I think evaluate whether you feel like we can do that for you, just again, based upon our research and what we've talked about. And if you feel like you want to learn more, no strings attached. I promise we're not super salesy people. We like to share what we do. If you just check out on social media and LinkedIn, I think you'll see that a lot of people appreciate what we do in the community. And we're happy to give you a threat briefing, give you a demo, whatever you want. If you want to learn more, I promise I'll keep my sales folks at bay, and I'll be the ones to personally deliver it.
Okay, so that is a very powerful message. I hope people take advantage of that for sure. All right, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Thanks, Paul, for joining us. I'll have links in our show notes for people to check out, including your LinkedIn profile, as well as the permiso.io/IDAC landing page. And then, of course, you can always visit us on the web at idacpodcast.com. Do all the cool things like subscribe, share with your friends, share with your enemies. In the opposite of Paul land, we want everyone to get into our episodes. So it is a wide open door for people to check out. So with that, thanks everybody for watching and or listening, and we'll talk with you all in the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.